Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Charis is delighted to welcome Donald Yacovone in conversation with Jillian Ford for a discussion of Teaching White Supremacy, America's Democratic Ordeal and the Forging of Our National Identity. It's a powerful exploration of the past and present arc of America's white supremacy, from the country's inception and revolutionary years to its 19th century flashpoint of the Civil War, to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, to today's Black Lives Matter movement. This event tonight is co-hosted by our friends at the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American culture and history. And we are, as always, very honored to be here with them. I'm first going to introduce Dr. Jillian Ford, who is an associate professor of social studies education of secondary and middle grades education department at Kennesaw State University. Ford draws on womanist and decolonial frameworks in her research and community work. She aligns herself with collaborative efforts to dismantle the status quo in schooling in the United States. In response to the anti-Black racism in Cobb County School District, she co-founded Stronger Together in 2018. Initially formed as a group with a sole focus of resisting racism in CCSD, the group has evolved to support Black youth and families in Cobb by organizing opportunities for self-exploration and community building. Ford's published work has appeared in the Journal of Curriculum Theorizing, Journal of Lesbian Studies, Multicultural Education, and several edited volumes. She is currently co-editing a volume that interrogates contemporary K-12 schooling with a decolonial lens, titled Disrupting Colonial Pedagogy, Theories and Transgressions. Jillian enjoys gardening, kayaking, and using snail mail when she is not organizing, and there was no one else that I wanted to have in conversation with Donald Yacovone. When I thought of this conversation, I immediately thought of Jillian Ford, whose work I have loved and respected for so long. So it is my honor to have you here, and it's my honor to have Donald here. He is the lifetime associate at Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. His book, The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, was co-written by Henry Louis Gates Jr. and won the 2014 NAACP Image Award. He is the recipient of the W.E.B. Du Bois Medal, Harvard's highest honor in the field of African American studies. Yacovone earned a PhD at the Claremont Graduate University and has taught at several colleges and universities. He helped edit the Black Abolitionist Papers, and before becoming the manager of research and program development at the Hutchins Center, Dr. Yacovone was the senior associate editor of publications at the Massachusetts Historical Society, where he founded and edited the Massachusetts Historical Review. He has written widely on abolitionism, gender, the African American role in the Civil War, white supremacy, and American cultural history. So we're delighted to have both of you here. We're in for a real treat. We want to encourage folks who are watching at home, wherever you're watching from, please ask questions. You can do that at any time. It is not disruptive. Just go ahead and put your questions in there, and Dr. Ford will weave them in throughout this conversation. We know many of y'all are parents and teachers who feel under attack right now in trying to work on the curriculum in your schools. So we want to hear what's going on the ground as well. So thank you for the work that you're all doing in your communities. Thank you to both of you. We're so excited to be celebrating this book with you tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ER, for inviting me to be a part of this exciting conversation. And thank you to Donald for writing this book. ER invited me and encouraged me to talk just a little bit about some of the work that we are doing in Cobb County, kind of as a entrance into the work that you've done to write this book. It's quite related. So I'll just share that we started in 2018 as a coalition to really push back against the anti-Black racism that was at that time, and unfortunately still is occurring in many of the Cobb County schools. So we came together as parents, students, and community members concerned about making sure that the Black students' voices were being heard. And much to our dismay, the majority of the school board has really ignored the students' complaints. And so, as ER alluded to, we started after several years of trying to get the attention of the school board. We decided to set up out of school spaces where we could encourage Black students to connect with themselves, to connect with nature, and to connect with each other. The latest work that we're doing, quite frankly, is in response to this most recent Georgia legislative session, in which that HB 1084 was passed, and that's also known as the Parents First Bill. So this act really outlines divisive concepts and outlaws teachers teaching what the legislators deem as divisive concepts. So there are several, but I just wanted to read a few because I think this will be a great way to begin the conversation about your book. So the following are a few divisive concepts as outlined by the right-wing state legislature. Teachers cannot teach that one race is inherently superior to another race. Teachers cannot teach that B, the United States of America, is fundamentally racist. Teachers cannot teach that C, an individual, by virtue of his or her race, is inherently racist or oppressive toward individuals of other races, while whether consciously or subconsciously. D, an individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of his or her race. So it goes on like this. And I think one of the shocking parts to us as educators, social studies educators who take history seriously and who understand the importance of teaching our youth history, the tone is so clearly directed toward a certain set of teachers. And those are teachers who want to teach the truth, because nobody is doing these things. There aren't teachers who are teaching as the legislators are implying that one race is inherently superior to another race. Teachers are not out here teaching that individuals' moral character is inherently determined by his or her race. So it's a very strange dynamic where they are enforcing, they have laid out a framework to target certain teachers if parents come forth and have complaints about what their child's teacher is teaching. So the one that I really want to highlight is that teachers are not to teach this divisive concept, that an individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress because of his or her race. So it's, again, a little bit confusing, but the problem that many of us have with this bill is that students do and have, for the history of common schooling in this country, felt discomfort, anguish, and problems, psychologically negative problems because of their race. However, in this legislation, they're talking about a certain set of students that they do not want to feel uncomfortable. So let me bring the conversation to you and ask really what brought you to this project.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for asking. And this is something that I have been concerned about since I began the research for this. I started this. Um, Actually, I didn't start this. I was writing a different book. And I went to, after spending uh, uh, most of one summer at the Houghton Library looking at the papers of John J. Chapman, 55 boxes of papers of John J. Chapman. I needed a break, so I thought I would go over to the School of Education at Harvard and examine some textbooks to see how they presented the history of the anti-slavery movement. The book I was working on was a study in public memory and popular memory, and how the legacy of the anti-slavery movement, how individuals remembered the anti-slavery movement, how that had an impact on the development of the modern civil rights movement. So I went over to the library and naively, very naively, thought I would look at a few textbooks, get a general sense of what had been taught, and be done with it. I wasn't some radical leftist out to get the United States. That was not my intent. I didn't even intend to do this. So this was about as honest and direct and pure motive from an historian's point of view as there is. What happened was I went over to the library. I got admitted into the special collections department. Wonderful librarians, just marvelous librarians who did everything they could to help. And they introduced me, and I think that's the right word, to their collection of textbooks, 3,000 of them. And I was stunned. It's just not something that I had anticipated. And I thought, well, what do I do now? So I started looking at the textbooks from about 1832 on, which was a year after the emergence of William Lloyd Garrison, again, for the original project that I was doing the research for, rather. I started with a textbook written by Noah Webster, the very same individual who's legendary for the dictionary. And I was taken aback by what I was reading. It was not what I expected. There, of course, was no mention of any abolitionism. Even the more modest version of abolitionism that had been brewing, well, since 1688 in the American colonies. No mention whatsoever of it. In fact, there was no mention of people of African descent at all, except for occasional references to slaves who were necessary to do, quote, the white man's labor. Well, the more of these books I looked at, going through the 1830s into the 1840s, the more astonished I became at the very deliberate, overt, and proud themes that were in these textbooks that, of course, were designed, intended, very directly intended to influence the rising generations of people who would be American citizens, children. And I was just taken aback by the very overt emphasis on whiteness and people of European descent as the builders, the owners and builders of this nation. And I didn't know what to expect. I could easily have found, theoretically at least, found references to dislike of slavery and this sort of thing. And some of the textbooks did say things like that early on, and then later dropped those criticisms. But I was so taken aback by this overt emphasis on whiteness and European activities in the New World that it shocked me out of my original book project. And the more of these textbooks I looked at, the more dramatic came this emphasis on whiteness. And I'll give you one example. I looked at one that was published in 1930. And on the very first page, in all capital letters, right at the top, it said, "The White Man's History." Now, you'd have to be pretty dense not to figure out what was going on with this book. And I decided, it took me maybe a day or two to decide that the project I had, while important, was being overwhelmed by what I was finding in these textbooks. Now, you also have to keep in mind that 6 years ago, when I started this, almost 6 years ago, when I started this project, no one was talking about white supremacy. No one was talking about, what was going on in classrooms. It was not part of the public discussion. I wasn't influenced by anyone or anything other than what I was seeing in a textbook.
Wow, that's really quite a story about how you came to this topic.
Let me interrupt for a second. There was, as I was going through these textbooks from the 1830s and 1840s, again, at the beginning, when I was still thinking about this other project, I felt almost a kind of indescribable force coming over me. And I don't know how else to describe it, because I'm the sort of person, you start a project, you bulldog your way through it and finish it. And
Sure.
And for me to get torn away from something that I'd already spent several months on. I'd already done research at the Mass Historical Society. I'd already done research at the Boston Athenaeum. I already spent most of the summer at the Houghton Library, as I said, going through 55 boxes of John J. Chapman papers. It took something almost otherworldly to draw me away from that. And so these books created a force that led me away from my original project and into this one. This wasn't the result of any kind of political stand, social stand, had nothing to do with public discussions, which didn't, as I said, didn't even exist at the time. I was simply overwhelmed by this collection of 3,000 textbooks and what they were telling me. Yeah.
Sure. Now, as you know, as a faculty member, sometimes we get very much tunnel vision on our topic, and it sounds like you were taken away with it. But I will say, with all due respect, that there were people having the conversations, right? There's a whole field of educational history that looks at much of what you've looked at, and in terms of both the pedagogy and the curriculum that has been used since the inception of Common School. So I won't say no one was talking about it, but certainly it was not in the mainstream, as you're saying now.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely. Yes, there have been several studies which I used previously published about textbooks, but what I was referring to were newspapers and public discussion, not academic or scholarly discussion. And you're quite right. There had been many individuals who had looked at what textbooks had said, but nowhere to the degree that I ended up doing. Yep.
Sure. Yes. Okay. Well, as you've mentioned, you wrote really a lot about how the theme of slavery and the anti-slavery movement was treated in textbooks over time. So you start in the antebellum period, go right through the war and into Reconstruction, and then post-Reconstruction. So
Right.
Can you talk a bit about kind of the arc that you found in the textbooks?
Regarding abolitionism?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Well, okay. this is this is relatively easy because there were no discussions of the anti-slavery movement before the Civil War in United States history textbooks. There is a model that most of these textbooks formed or followed rather, and what you find is a really sort of systematic study beginning with European exploration, European colonization, the movement to the revolution, constitution forming, and then each successive presidential administration. And history took place nowhere else. This is the model that nearly all textbooks followed, with every paragraph numbered. This is the model they almost all followed, certainly through the 1830s, 40s, and into the 1850s to become a little bit more diverse in the 1850s, but they largely stick close to this model. And one author, a very famous American educator, Emma Willard, in the 1855 edition of her U.S. history textbook, which, by the way, Daniel Webster kept on his desk, did mention directly one abolitionist, but it was a British abolitionist. And the reason why she mentioned him, was because this was, to her mind, part of the British conspiracy to destroy the United States and to end slavery. And so she mentioned a British abolitionist who was who allied with William Lloyd Garrison, and condemned him. And about 1860, one other textbook mentioned by name another abolitionist, John Brown, but dismissed him as insane. There was no discussion of a abolitionist movement. There was no discussion of the founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society, or the New England Anti-Slavery Society, or any anti-slavery society. There was no discussion of the long-standing Quaker and Mennonite opposition to slavery in the North. Nothing of that sort. Again, a model that almost all textbooks followed up until the Civil War was the one I had laid out, and they never diverted from it. And in fact, that model does persist after the Civil War, though it becomes less dominant than it had previously. That is, looking at American history as European exploration, colonization, the revolution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The model changes pretty dramatically for a brief period of time after the American Civil War, where radical Reconstruction begins haltingly and never permanently, but begins to transform American understanding of its mission. The new textbook authors like Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who had been an abolitionist before the war and commanded the 1st South Carolina Volunteers during the war, wrote a U.S. history textbook, and it was really more like a novel and a book than the model I had previously mentioned. And here, this is the time when abolitionists become the heroes. There had been, as I said, some scattered references to abolitionists, but since history only took place in Congress and among politicians like Daniel Webster, Henry Clay. There's no room for things like women's rights or black rights or anything of that sort. It's very strictly political, very focused on Congress once the United States is formed, and that's the model that's followed. After the American Civil War, there is this explosion of interest in achieving racial equality that the end of slavery began. This was the intent of these new textbooks, and there were many of them that persisted right through into the 1880s, and some even lasted well into the beginning of the 20th century, where the abolitionists are heroes. Nat Turner isn't damned as a violent slave who deserved the fate he got. He's seen as a forerunner during this brief period, during and after, immediately after Reconstruction, seen as a heroic figure, as someone who was issuing a warning to the nation that slavery could not be and should not be tolerated. All this comes to pretty much a crashing end by the turn of the century, where it is about 1900 to 1911, the lost cause ideology that, interestingly enough, actually first began in the North, not in the South, had taken hold of the academic community. And scholars in the 1880s and 1890s began to rewrite the history of the past that individuals like Elisha Mulford tried to bring into what we would see today as a modern era of racial justice, of true democracy. And that is no exaggeration. It is exactly what Mulford and Charles Carlton Coffin argued for. Coffin was the North's most famous Civil War reporter, and he dedicated his life after the war to writing textbooks that would trace the rise of liberty. It's an extraordinary, brief but extraordinary explosion of interest in creating the equality that radical Reconstruction attempted to do. But by the 1880s and 1890s, as this stuff is coming out, it's creating a response, a deadly response, repudiating Reconstruction as a period of corruption and evil led by these weasels from the North who went south to trick what these books called ignorant, incompetent Negroes, quote unquote, to do their bidding. It was a horrific eruption of hate and rejection of radical Reconstruction, which existed simultaneously to these other books that heralded the beginning of true democratic society. So there's almost a kind of war going on between these two versions of the past. And the version of Coffin and Elisha Mulford dies by about 1911. And this horrific interpretation of the past takes hold even among historians who rejected slavery, even among historians who wrote these textbooks, who approved of the abolitionist movement, but when these same historians wrote about the history of Reconstruction, their true point, their true mission became quite clear. And again and again and again, and I can't tell you, there's an endless, I looked at and cited in the book 50 different textbooks that had the same ugly interpretation of Reconstruction that was essentially a criminal activity by misguided people of the North who used the former slaves to literally economically rape the South. It is an ugly manifestation of American history, and it was not. And this is one of the major themes of the book. It is not something that was devised by Southern historians or Southern authors. This was something that was propagated by Northern authors, Northern presses based in Boston, New York, and Chicago. And this version of the past continued well into the 20th century, right into the 1960s. It didn't begin to be attacked and changed until the late 1960s. And even at that, it took decades for the textbooks to catch up to the advances that scholars were making in the scholarly community. So,
Sure. Yes. Thank you for that. You know, when you talk about these Northern publishers who are churning out these books,
yep.
It makes me think about, and obviously thinking about how common understanding and patriotic understanding is developed through the schools. It becomes more clear, to me at least, that these same Northern scholars and writers and publishers were simultaneously advocating for or painting a rosy picture of the North before the Civil War and during the Civil War, and simultaneously painting a horrible picture, of the South before the Civil War. And so I'm just wondering, to what extent do you think that today's adult population, especially perhaps Northerners, especially perhaps Northern white folks, think about the South in ways that have been shaped by their own education?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there is I not only think, I believe there's a tendency for Northern-born people of European descent to assign responsibility to the South for the creation of racism. I think there's a tendency to look to the institution of slavery and Southern resistance to the civil rights movement as the explanation, the definitive explanation as to why racial prejudice existed and still exists.
Sure.
This is, considering what I found and what I detail in the book, it sounds almost like a deliberate attempt to push off responsibility onto someone else rather than to acknowledge one's own responsibility in the formation of what essentially is American identity.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found over and over and over again was Northern responsibility for creating the ideology of white supremacy, which certainly grew alongside the institution of slavery in the colonial era, developed during the era of slavery, and then exploded in importance after the institution of slavery, formal institution of slavery, ended. It is I use, well, there are two things. One, if you look at every important area of American cultural development, where they're looking at literature, religion, art, and certainly medicine, science, and the law, Northern leaders like Ralph Waldo Emerson or Walt Whitman express the most painful racial remarks that you could ever imagine. That they stated over, and in a case of Whitman, grossly, openly, the preference for whiteness. If you look at the individuals who developed the legal background for white supremacy, it is Northerners, Boston in particular. The legacy is clear, and indeed, the 19th century father of white supremacy was a Canadian-born New Yorker, John H. Van Every. And of course, you can't get any more northern than Canada. Mm-hmm. And he created a whole racist empire in the middle of Manhattan to convince the entire nation of the need to recognize the quote-unquote Negro as an inferior, lesser form of human. A human, certainly, but a different species of human is what he called it, who was created by God and nature to do, quote, the white man's work, unquote. And he spent his life, most of his life, from the 1840s into the 1870s, publishing a vast array of two newspapers, books, 4 of his own books, and countless pamphlets to spread this interpretation of race in America. In fact, he went so far as to say that slaves did not even exist in America. People who we would recognize as the enslaved of the South weren't slaves. That was a term reserved, to his mind, a term reserved for white Europeans who had been enslaved in ancient times by other white Europeans. That was a white institution. What he recognized in the South was the people of African descent doing the work that God and nature intended. They were no more slaves, he wrote, than cattle, oxen, or sheep. They were simply doing the work God intended for them. And he went on to argue in many of his books that rather than what some Northerners, for instance, the founders of the American Colonization Society in the North, who wanted to get rid of the African American presence, he did not want to get rid of Africans. He not only wanted them here, he believed it was the best thing that ever happened in America because their presence, to his mind, created white democratic society. They were, he said, as necessary as boys on a seesaw. They were the balance. They were the balancing factor that helped create American democracy. It's an extraordinary man who published these ideas and more throughout the United States. As I said, he published 2 of his own newspapers. And on top of that, he ran advertisements and analysis. Like Whitman, he reviewed his own books. And he published these announcements, advertisements, and portions of his selections of his writings in almost all the newspapers in the country. In fact, in one year, he ran advertisements right after the Civil War in 1,400 different American newspapers. People in Britain knew of him and had read his work. His works were cited in Congress, in state legislatures. In fact, the so-called lost cause movement and the women, United Daughters of the Confederacy, long after the war, adopted his interpretation of American life, the creation, the occurrence of the American Civil War, and Lincoln's evil purposes, and reprinted them. He, more than anyone else, helped form the Southern view of the Lincoln administration and the coming of the Civil War. So the responsibility of Northerners for the creation of American, what we would see as racial ideas or racial ideology, is in no uncertain terms profound.
Sure. I see in the chat there are some comments and questions. One is what was the name of this Canadian again?
Oh, John H. Van, V-A-N, Every, E-V-R-I-E.
Thank you.
Yep.
And I see also that someone commented on your comment a while back about history only existed in Congress. And so you talk about that several times throughout the book about, a focus on a certain type of electoral politics that was the center of history as taught in schools. And I'm wondering,
go ahead. Sorry.
I'm wondering what you think about the work of Howard Zinn, who so famously interrupted that and really looked at the people's history.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, many professional historians wouldn't necessarily adopt his interpretation of certain events. I think his influence in changing the kinds of questions that professional historians ask is profound. And I think because of individuals like Zinn and earlier individuals, we had the emergence of social history. And of course, from that, you get, women's rights, gender, masculinity, all sorts of things that historians previously, certainly previous to the 1960s, never would have considered and never would have included in a book. History simply took place among political leaders, period. That clearly is no longer the case, but it was dominant from the very beginning. And I think some of the first textbooks came out in about 1800. And it wasn't until right after the Civil War then that model began to change, but nothing to the degree of this kind of social history that we now write and read. Yeah.
Sure. I was pleased to see, in the end, near the end of the book in chapter 8, Renewing the Challenge, that you did bring up and give credit to W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson as historians who were depicting Black life and history in quite complex ways. And so we can see that as more people had opportunity for more education, that those stories were being filled in, as
absolutely. It's so critical that the individuals like Du Bois did that work, and it certainly was the case that at the time, the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, most white professional historians dismissed their work, wouldn't pay any attention to it, but they had a great impact on many of the black schools in the South, because states, in many cases, surprisingly, at least to my mind, it was surprisingly approved of the purchase of black authored histories for the segregated black schools. So they got to benefit from that history that African Americans were writing, and also benefited from the fact that they weren't forced to read some of the horrific characterizations of slave life that were commonplace in other textbooks. I was just horrified when I found out at this one book by a gentleman named Worth, which had a gross characterization of plantation life of slaves, was commonly used. This would be in the 1940s. In the 1940s, commonly used among black schools in the South because the states forced them. But in other cases, Alabama, Mississippi, there was a great deal of latitude, and the work of men like Du Bois did get adopted. And even if people of European descent in the North didn't read them, they would eventually read them. And of course, Du Bois is an icon, an unmatched icon now, recognized as such. Sure. Absolutely, sure.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to open it up to those of you who have joined us this evening. If there are questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. While you're doing so, I will go actually back to the beginning of the book. It struck me, you started with a quote from Horace Mann, and there's such an irony to me to the quote, and I'm wondering how you feel about it in contemporary life. So you say Horace Mann said, when the teacher fails to meet the intellectual wants of a child, it is the case of asking for bread and receiving a stone. But when he fails to meet its moral wants, it is giving a serpent. So I'm curious how that relates to the rest of your book and how you think it might relate to our contemporary issues.
Well, you were wise to pick on that. And Horace Mann, of course, is an amazingly contradictory figure. But I think, first of all, Horace Mann being sort of the father of modern American public education and teacher training, understood, and on this I have to agree completely with him, understood how important the role of the teacher is in shaping the social and intellectual attitudes of Americans. They're, other than one's parents, it's the teachers who have such a dramatic impact on the moral and intellectual development of our children. And he understood that, probably, certainly during his age, more than anyone. The problem that we face when we look at Horace Mann is that while his role in developing teacher training programs, what they used to call normal schools, is absolutely indispensable and critical, he was also an avowed racist. And this divided legacy is deeply troubling to me. And I have to say that I was genuinely shocked when I was reading a collection of his speeches that he had published during his lifetime. And he referred, as Benjamin Franklin had said the same thing earlier, that the problem with slavery was that it taught white people not to work, made them lazy and indifferent to labor. And Horace Mann picked up on this, and he was a representative. He also became a representative, political representative in Congress. And on the floor of Congress, he denounced the influence of slaves upon white people. And this is a theme over and over again. The real sufferers in American history were not slaves; they were the white people. This is textbooks, particularly in the 20th century, pick up this theme over and over and over again. Well, in the 19th century, this was I think in the 1840s, Horace Mann said on the floor of Congress that this is so deeply troubling. The white women learned not to work because work was tainted, because work was something only slaves did. And in their case, their, quote, black sluts, unquote, damaged the reputation of work for white people. Well, when I read those words, I couldn't believe it. Now, it is true that in the 19th century, the word slut did refer to someone who worked into a kitchen, but it also had simultaneously had the same definition that we assign to it today, and that he would use that term on the floor of Congress simply shocked me. Even though I knew he was a rabid colonizationist, he opposed William Lloyd Garrison and the anti-slavery movement. The only version of abolitionism he would support was the expulsion of Northern blacks. That is a legacy which is deeply troubling to me. There's a statue of him on the front of Massachusetts State House. Now, on the one hand, he deserves recognition for the work he did in establishing teacher training and supporting public education. Absolutely. But at the same time, his racial attitudes were horrific, some of the worst that I've seen in the North. But it's by no means the only Northerner. It's distressingly common in the 19th century, distressingly common. In fact, as a personal aside, now I lived for almost 7 years in Tallahassee, Florida. And that's Panhandle country, that's the Deep South. I spent a lot of time in Georgia. But when I moved north, 1991, to the Boston area, it was the first time that I saw overt public racist comments made by white people, thinking that I was one of them and I would just, I would understand. I never heard anything like that when I lived in Tallahassee, the Deep South. But I heard it all the time up here. And I can't use some of the language I heard from my own neighbor, a former police officer.
Sure. Goodness. All right. Well, thank you. I see some more questions here. Let me ask you this. Can you please talk about the textbook industry that profits from these false narratives?
Oh, that's a really good question. During the early 20th century, a conglomerate was formed, American Publishing Company, which dominated the textbook industry up until the 1930s or 40s, I think. But from about 1911, the 19 teens up through the 1930s, American Publishing Company just owned almost the entire business. And therefore, what they did went. What they wanted went. You had no choice. And what they often did, and scholars, professors, Harvard scholars who wrote some of these textbooks, complained bitterly that although we might recognize what they wrote as being offensive, they were even offended by the changes the publisher had done to appeal to a Southern audience. So an author would create write a textbook. It would be marketed in the North, but a different version was marketed in the South. And one scholar just was so livid, he denounced his own book as a quote, a collection of lies, unquote. It's astonishing, I think, from a modern perspective. However, it's not all that different. As you probably well know, Texas and California are major drivers of the textbook industry, and because their student populations are so large. So if Texas doesn't want to call enslaved people slaves and just imported workers, they get to do that and have done it until 2019.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
I see that we're running close on time, but there are a few more questions here. I'll just end, I think, with this one. It's quite related to what you were just talking about. How do you think the history of current events will be written with regards to the Georgia legislation, Florida's stop
Yeah,
bill?
that's a great way to end this, because I think that's an entree into what we are seeing more generally, and what I have tried to do with this book. And that is, what we are seeing is that American identity, which has from the beginning been defined as white, people of white European descent, those were true Americans. Everyone else was outside of that realm, of that definition. And what we are seeing now are threats to that superstructure.
Right.
And it is clear from the demographics that, certainly within 30 or 40 years, people of European descent will be just one more minority. This has created a dramatic trauma for many Americans, perhaps 35% or so, who are traumatized that their identity and the identity of Americanness is being threatened. And what we are seeing in this attempt in Florida in particular, and Georgia, are last-ditch, desperate efforts to forestall what they see as inevitable. And what is inevitable is the decline of white supremacy.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, at this point, I want to invite ER back in. I think he'll come in to close us out.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know folks have so many good questions, and I'm sorry we can't get to all of them, but I want to encourage you to read this book. So you can click the teal button at the bottom of the screen to buy Teaching White Supremacy, America's Democratic Ordeal, and the Forging of Our National Identity from Charis. It really will get into a lot of these questions. And of course, you can follow Dr. Jillian Ford's work. Jillian, do you want to put in the chat where folks can follow you?
Sure.
So that folks who are living locally in Georgia can get involved. We encourage you, of course, to support the work of the Auburn Avenue Research Library. And if you would like to support the work of Charis Circle, our nonprofit, you can do that by donating any amount. We really do appreciate you. And we hope that you will continue to attend Charis events and continue these conversations. They're so important. Thank you, Dr. Yacovone. This is a really important book, and we're very excited to get to honor it tonight and just, scratch at the surface of these conversations. But the book does so much, and I know folks are going to be excited to dig into it. So,
well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I hope you both stay safe and well. Thank you, Jillian, for your great interviewing skills. And until next time, take care, everybody.
Thank you.